Welcome, friends, foes, and fans of the finer points of market value. Today we gather on the proverbial green, powder dry, wigs high, for a civil clash of uncivilized ideas. Is appraisal an art or a science? In one corner, Tim Andersen, armed with standards and an affection for repeatable results, will argue that appraisal is science, cold, calculated, and measurable. In the other corner, Marty Wagar, clutching his gut and a hunch, will argue that valuation is an art, a dash of intuition, a pinch of feel, a sensibility that is as much qualitative as quantitative. But here's the wrinkle I'd like to toss into the punch bowl. Real science isn't just a recipe, it's an exploration. It's jazz, it's Picasso before he broke the face. Mastery of fundamentals that leads to discovery, not dogma. The best scientists, like the best appraisers, follow the data even when it tells them something they didn't expect. And while big data may tell us what happened, it's thick data, the why, that brings meaning. That's where the human appraiser, the anthropologist with a clipboard, still matters. We're not here to just press buttons, we're here to ask better questions. So we're going to let the debate begin here in just a moment. May your mind stay open, your comps be clean, and your adjustments defensible. And remember, Marty and Tim are arguing points. They've been assigned these roles. They've been told to take each one of these sides of the debate on with a full-throated, defense. These may not be their actual opinions. We're just here to continue the debate, have the discussion, and make us all better appraisers. Marty, Tim, thank you so much for being here. We're so glad that you're here.
Welcome. Glad to be here.
Hal, thank you. It's good to be here with both of you to take this on. And I'm sure that Marty has his health insurance paid up because once we're done, he's going to need it.
And Marty also has this. Okay.
I can't see that. It blurred out.
Well, it's my wig. So
nice.
Just so you know.
Nice. So here's the thing. We have a hard stop at 11:30 Central Time, 12:30 Eastern Time. We've got exactly 90 minutes to get through this thing. So who wants to go first with their opening statements for why appraisal is art or science?
I will acquiesce to Mr. Andersen. Go for it, counsel.
Thank you, Marty. Thank you, Hal. Thank you, everybody, for being here. We appreciate it. The whole purpose of Wigs on the Green is to cause folks to think critically, to cause folks to think differently than they may have otherwise. Now, when Hal broached the topic of appraisal, is it art or is it science? I must take some umbrage with Hal's very narrow interpretation of the term appraisal. Now, you have to understand that we all like each other, but we're still going to be going for blood as this progresses. Now, Hal said appraisal, art or science. Well, the thing is, that's like saying elephant, big or gray. Well, yeah, that doesn't mean anything. So we've got to break appraisal down into its components, because I will concede to Marty and Hal know this, I will concede that certain parts of appraisal are art, but the art comes second. The science must come first. Now, Marty and I have spoken, Marty and I both love art, and we have spoken of Da Vinci's Last Supper. Now, Da Vinci's Last Supper is painted in what originally was a barn. And the guy who owned the barn, wanted his cows to look at something nice. So he calls Leo over and say, hey, Leo, paint the wall. So, and of course, this was a time when all paintings like that were religiously oriented, etc. So the guy figures, Leo's going to show up with a bunch of paint buckets and paint, and he's going to be gone in a couple of weeks. Well, no, that's not what happened. He showed up and for about a week did nothing except sit there staring at the wall. And he made some notes and he spliced a little color on the wall, but he just looked at the wall for about a week. Then, after a week, 10 days, then finally he got a scaffolding. And in the what was going to be for him the center of the painting, he painted a square approximately 1 foot by 1 foot. In other words, the dimensions of the human skull, human head. It was not the center of the wall. It was not the optical center of the wall, but it was going to be the center of the painting. Then once he had that done, he took some more time to draw in the proportion lines and draw in the perspective lines. If you look at the painting today, you'll notice that it centers on Christ's head, which is where Da Vinci drew that square. But the lines of the room, what would amount to be the beams on the wall and on the ceiling, are the perspective lines. And he did that because he wanted your eye to go directly to the figure of the Christ, because that was the center of the painting. And then he did the rest of the painting. Now, this is not to be a critique of Leonardo's painting techniques, because I don't know squat about painting. But the point was, before he started to engage in the art, he had to engage in the science. He had to engage in the perspective. He had to know who would go where. He had to know what roles they would play. Because that painting, even though it's static, is a play. And it's got about 15 people in it, and they each have different parts, and they each play them extremely well, because Da Vinci was also a director. And he knew what it would take to make this painting not just paint on walls, but something living, something that would cause folks to look at it and think, which is exactly what happened. Now, fast forward to today. Standard one is science. Standard one is the development of the value opinion. That's science. We don't guess, at least we're not supposed to. At least that's not what we tell folks in QE. We're not supposed to guess. We're supposed to take, and I hope you can see this on the camera, we're supposed to take a whole bunch of stuff, some of which is eventually going to prove to be irrelevant, and narrow it down to this, which is a value conclusion, ideally a range, but a value conclusion. That's the science. That's the statistics. That's why we need to know, okay, how far away do the individual sales lie from the mean? What are the gross adjustment ratios? Stuff like this. We have to understand that science. Hal mentioned that science is a journey. It is. It's a journey of discovery. We don't know what the property is worth when we walk in there. We may have an idea. We may say, well, yeah, it's a $400,000 or $500,000 neighborhood. Okay, we have to develop that. But we walk in there and we don't have a clue what the house is worth. We have to go through the science that we have been taught in order to eliminate what's irrelevant. So what's left tells us within reason what that property is worth. That's the science. And Marty is an instructor. I'm an instructor. Hal's an instructor. We all teach real estate appraisal. And we all agree that from a standpoint of qualifying education, QE, science is not what we teach. We teach folks how to fill out boxes. We don't teach science. Now, we do teach art, but that's standard two. But I'm going to get to that in a minute. So, Marty, lick your wounds, dress your broken bones. Go ahead.
I'm going to jump in real quick. Tim.
Please do.
Tim, do you know what Jesus said to the disciples on the night of the Last Supper?
Who's going to pay for this?
I do. Yeah.
If you want to be in the picture, you got to sit on this side of the table.
I thought he said separate checks. But
Go ahead, Marty.
Well, Tim, thank you for enlightening me. And I hope you're not suggesting that Da Vinci was a paint by numbers guy. I would have to beg to differ that while you certainly do set up cubists and you set up everything, when you actually dip the paint in the paintbrush, you vary from the science and you paint and you do follow both. And I will be the first to admit, very first to admit that there is a blend of both. You can't do one without the other. You absolutely can't. And I want to first say that I want to bring this down from maybe the philosophy of what we're doing to the practicality. I came back from NAR and was in a meeting, and it just seemed that there was a confusion between distinguishing between what Fannie Mae, the GSEs want, and what we do, and they lend on risk and we appraise for value, and the two clash, and that's where the concept of adjustments come from. And to bring it down even further, I spent some time with ChatGPT and talked about asking a lot of different questions. For instance, the principle of substitution. How do you apply the principle of substitution from a scientific standpoint? And it talked about it's not purely a data matching process. It requires human judgment. And my philosophy is that Da Vinci first set it up scientifically so it would look right and everything, and then he applied the gray matter. He applied the art of what he did. I recall asking ChatGPT, so if I want to live in a very serene part of town and I have this, and this, where would you suggest I go? And it couldn't answer me. It gave me a lot of platitudes, but at the end of the day, it said, I can't answer your question without applying some philosophical issues that you're going to have to answer for me. So, the principle of substitution requires equal utility, not just similar specs. And I'm going to leave it. I'll leave my part of the argument there, that you can't practice the principle of substitution without practicing gray matter, without you talk to any agent and they will ask several questions before you start to look at houses. It's those questions that the appraisers should or have to answer before they start looking for comparables. It's something I say in more than one of my classes when I do a reconsideration of value and somebody says they'll send me comparables. I say, no, you won't send me comparables. You send me sales. I determine if they're comparables, and it's the gray matter here to see if they follow or if they qualify for the principle of substitution.
Okay, Hal, may I rebut? Which
absolutely.
Is an inside joke that the three of us will understand. Okay. Marty, I must agree with you to some extent.
No.
Frankly. Oh, okay. All right. Well, then, okay, let's talk about good restaurants in Las Vegas. All right. Hal, you mentioned that science is a discovery. Okay, it is. But one of the aspects of science is it is serendipity happens, but that's not what science seeks. And serendipity is discovering something lovely that you didn't know you were looking for. Okay, science asks a question and then looks at the data in order to see if the data answer the question. All right, now let us suppose we've got a house and it's in a $400,000 to $500,000 neighborhood. So we say, okay, $450,000, just as a place to start, knowing we're not anchoring to anything, and that's not where we're going to end necessarily. Now, the point is, then we're going to look at the data. Then we're going to analyze the data. And this is the gray matter. We're going to analyze the data. We're going to eliminate, if the subject is a 5, 3.5 with a 3-car garage, we're going to get rid of the 2 ones because they're not comparable. They don't have the same highs and best use. So once we've gotten rid of the irrelevant data, once we've gotten rid of the erroneous data, somebody sold the house to their kids as a wedding present, sold it for $10. Okay. Once we get rid of the irrelevant data, once we get rid of the erroneous data, then what's left are the accurate, reproducible, reliable data. And then it is from those data, it is from our analyses of those data, it is from, as Marty put, the exercise of the gray matter relative to those data, that we are going to come to a preliminary, let me stress preliminary, value conclusion. That's the science. Because what we're saying is, let me find out what is similar to the subject. Let me eliminate what is different enough that it would pollute my answers. And then I'm going to come up with an answer to the question. Now, that's fine, but that's not where we can stop. What we have to do is we have to go to the next step. And that next step says, okay, everything tells me that the house ought to have a value 450-ish. But why do they tell me that? And until we can answer the why question, until we can remove the vast majority of the uncertainty, which is what science does, our $450,000 is a guess. Now, is it an educated guess? Is it a narrowed down guess? Is it a scientific wild ass guess? Maybe, but it's still a guess. Now, the art comes only once we have reached that point. The science, we must exhaust the science before we can introduce the art. And the problem is, and we were talking about this before we went on the air, the Fannie Mae comes out with a new set of rules and says appraisers thou shalt make time adjustments. And some appraisers are going, no, I'm not going to make a time adjustment. The rationale being, well, if I don't make it, I don't have to be held responsible for it. And that's completely total. Not only is it completely and totally erroneous, it's unethical and incompetent, because a zero adjustment is an adjustment. Its quantity is zero. Therefore, we have to be able to support the zero adjustment. There's no art there. That is pure science.
Okay, so
the art comes in explaining the decisions. And at that point, I will apologize for my rudeness.
No. You weren't rude at all. I will say, look, I agree with you by and large. I mean, look, at the end of the day, I don't know what the parts are, but appraisal is part art, part science. That's what I came into this with. Here's the thing. A big data set. Let's look at Zillow, for instance. Every appraiser's favorite tool. Let's look at Zillow. It is looking at single point observations of data, number of bedrooms, number of bath, square footage, quantifiable, measurable metrics. What Zillow cannot do is tell you how this house feels as compared to how this house feels. That is that esoteric piece that appraisers. I had a conversation with somebody from Freddie Mac a couple of weeks ago. Somebody who is a friend of mine, lives in my same town. He knows who he is. Some of you may know who he is. I'm not going to say a name, but literally he said, appraisers are really good at picking comps. Here's the thing. There's an art to picking comps, because it's not all cut and dried. This number of bathrooms, this many bedrooms, this many square feet. Therefore, this is the same as this. There are other features that are not necessarily as measurable that come into play. And I think we work with art and science throughout the entire process. That's just my thought. Marty, you want to jump in here?
I do. I do. I want to opine a little bit more because that's where this comes down to. You can practice the science after the comparable sales are selected. You talk to any appraiser who has been sent comparables or alleged comparables, they will look at it and say, well, you can't adjust those. Those aren't adjustable. They're not comparable. So it does go back to if you had to define where the art and science is, I suppose the art would be in selection, practicing the principle of substitution that a typical buyer would do. Then I can do all the science in the world. Just to opine, the principle of substitution states that a buyer will not pay more for a property than the cost of acquiring a comparable alternative that equally satisfies their wants and needs. When applied to human selection, a house location, the principle takes on a behavioral and emotional dimension. When you go into it further, it talks about when selecting locations, there are intangible factors: neighborhood feel, school reputation, commute time, sense of community, noise levels of streets. You take a property that is truly not in a comparable location as the typical buyer would see, and you can adjust it all day long. You can apply your polynomial graphs and you can apply whatever it is you like, and you're not going to get the right answer. It is an algebraic problem that when you make a mistake at the beginning, you're never going to come up with the right answer. When you talk to any appraiser who has had comparables, quote unquote, sent to them, one might be a tri-level, one might be a ranch, one might be a two-story. The appraisal valuation models, which we'll get into in a minute, which is the antithesis of science. In other words, that is coming up with a market value, with an estimated market value, without applying any gray matter whatsoever. Everything is coming from the science aspect. So I still hang my hat in that, and I don't know, Hal, like you, I don't know what the difference is. I don't know what the percentage is. All I know is one can't exist without the other. Do we have to apply the science? Yeah, we absolutely do. But until you practice the art, until you set up the canvas and know what's in here, what you're going to do, how you're going to come up with and this is something that's becoming a lost art, and that's identifying the units of measurement. I did a house when I worked for as chief appraiser. One of the first reviews I got back was a house at Whitefish Point in Michigan. It's up where the Edmund Fitzgerald went down. My chief underwriter took me in a room and said, "We need to talk about this. This is a horrible appraisal." And I said, "There's only 7 sales on Whitefish Point," and she used all of them. She found the unit of measurement that works. She applied the gray matter to go, how can I measure a buyer, what's in a buyer's mind that's going to buy here? And then I will practice the science. And my underwriter, who was following the science, said, well, we need another appraisal because this one just sucks. This is horrible. And I said, no, actually, it's a good appraisal. The units of measurement have been selected from all different comparable sales because the primary reason somebody will buy there comes from the gray matter. Why do I want to buy here? Then I will go in and extract. And we actually ended up not making the loan because it was just too far out of the bell curve. But it was a good appraisal. And had you run that through an AVM, I'm not sure what you would have gotten. But to know what drives a person to buy there is truly an art.
Tim?
Marty, thank you for bringing up the issue of the Edmund Fitzgerald. And what is it saying? The old timers all say she'd have made Whitefish Bay if she'd put 15 more miles
behind her. Yeah.
Okay. The issue, Marty, is in this particular instance where there had been 7 sales in the past 300 years in this particular neighborhood is an outlier. Now, Ben Carson, surgeon, a famous doctor, performed one of the first operations in which he disjoined or unjoined co-joined twins who were joined at the head. They shared a brain. And let's face it, they don't teach you that in medical school. So he had to understand the science of neurology and histology and osteology and all of that stuff. And even then, before he did the operation, which he did, he told the parents that chances are one of them, there was at least a 50-50 chance one of them would die. And there was about an 80% chance that one of them would be challenged the rest of her life. He did the separation, and I don't quote me on this, but if I recall correctly, they both survived, and one was mentally challenged, although the other one was fine. Now, he didn't know what he was getting into. I mean, they had back then, I don't know if they had MRIs, but they had x-rays and they had whatever else they had, and they'd had tests, and they knew where the main arteries and veins were in the cranium, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But as he was cutting in there, this was the first time. Not only had this ever been done on the planet, this was the first time this had ever been done in the history of humanity. So there was no science at that point. It was all art. I agree. But yet he couldn't engage in the art until he understood the science. And this is where we fail. Because,
go ahead. I'm going to hop in real quick. I think that if you're listening to this webinar, if you take nothing else away, take the point away. We as appraisers must have a mastery of the fundamentals of appraisal theory. I think that is part of what allows us to then engage with the artistic side. Spencer P. Says in the Q&A section there, it's a science. The communication is the art. Comparable selection should be based on the statistical analysis of the subject in relation to other similar units. Then we communicate how the subject is placed and such after adjustments are quantified and other additional market indications such as sales price per square foot, assessed values, views, blah, blah, blah. The last tiny part of communicating the results in a manner that can be understood is the art. Marty, respond to that.
Well, is he related, Tim? You send him a check?
Insofar as I know, insofar as what my parents told me, I'm an only child.
My response is the same as it was before, and it is that the art, certainly there is an art at writing. There certainly is an art at communicating how you did what you did. But way back when you watch Antiques Roadshow, watch any of the shows where they're trying to come up, the first thing they talk about is comparable sales. There is no science that will pull comparable sales other than the AVMs, which we'll talk about later.
Marty,
when they draw heat maps with values, when they draw heat maps that show the different values as they change. That's what geographic competence is supposed to be. It's supposed to be about. I don't dispute that there is an art, certainly, to communicating what you do. And many appraisers, as we all have reviewed reports, are not very good at it, and they need to get better at it. But way back when the appraisal starts is, where do I go to select the units of measurement? Where do the buyers think is similar? And I have page after page of talking about that economic logic, but it's real world sophistication and residential appraisal that relies heavily on professional judgment. You can't do what we do without some judgment. And I'll touch on this it's a little bit early, but I'm going to touch on it first because the best example is probably the appraisal valuation models, the ones that don't use the gray matter. They don't have any gray matter. They have whatever matter they have. I've been involved with NAR for 25, 30 years, and they developed a very, very good AVM, and it's an AVM that uses the most recent data. And I remember one of them. One of the principals, and I'm not sure he was bragging, but he said they're 75% accurate 80% of the time. Well, that's 60%. Even if you go to 90, well, now we're 90% accurate 90% of the time. That's only still 81%. If you're Fannie Mae and you're writing a 95% loan to value, that's a problem. There has to be some exercise in judgment during the appraisal process.
Tim.
Well, first of all, Marty, I watch Antiques Roadshow every time I look in a mirror. Okay. Marty, we don't appraise furniture. We appraise real estate. And as a result, your analogy fails, and it fails miserably. And the reason it fails miserably is because we have let's face it, somebody is looking for a book that contains Abraham Lincoln's signature. Well, okay, if you're not an American history buff, unless you're buying it purely and solely as an investment, who cares? Now, if you're buying it purely and solely as an investment, okay, different story. But we've got to consider the legal, the ethical, and the physical aspects of the property. My wife and I have been binge watching the original Appraiser series as well as some other ones, and there is one in which Niles and Appraiser find an old Russian clock, and originally, Hal, you're familiar with that one, and it originally came from the Romanov Palace, and of course they think it's worth an absolute bloody fortune, and so do the Russians, and the Russians want it back. And the Russians were able to show that the property was stolen by a distant relative of Fraser and Niles, who was a whore in New York. So all of a sudden, that clock wasn't quite so important to Fraser and Niles anymore. So we're looking at a situation, Marty, where we can't mix the metaphors of a piece of furniture and a piece of real property. And we've got Hal made the point about science. That comes first. I don't debate that there's art there someplace, but we don't teach the science, and we merely imply the art. So until we teach the science, which should be part of QE, and we're not going to go into, okay, what should the educational level of appraisers be, because that's just going to upset way too many people. But the point is, we don't teach the science. Hell, we don't even teach the art. We just imply that appraisal is art, and therefore way too many people treat it that way, and they say, well, it's just my opinion. Well, that's true. It's just your opinion. But if your opinion is based on faulty analyses, if your opinion is based on insufficient data, if your opinion is based on your own biases, then your opinion is doo-doo.
Marty?
Yeah, and perhaps I was moving a little too fast for you, Tim, because
thank you for moving slowly.
The concept of Antiques Roadshow analogy is what gets into buyers' minds between the 5 inches here, why I buy what I buy, that I'm going to spend half a million dollars for, or $20,000 for. The concept is, how can I find something that will react the same way in order to come up with a value? It's not buying furniture. Actually, we are buying sticks and stones in one form or another. But it was an analogy that uses the same concepts, the same units of measurement. If I'm using something that was signed by Abraham Lincoln, can I find something that was signed by somebody who was equally as important to see if I can draw the similarity? And I don't think it failed. If it did, it wasn't miserably, I don't think. But I slowed it down for you a little bit. Yes, Hal.
I'm going to jump in here as de facto judge and arbiter. I'm just going to lay this out there. From a factual basis, we as appraisers deal with USPAP. USPAP Standard 7 deals with what?
The valuation of personal property.
Furniture is what?
Personal property.
I have case law from Tennessee where an appraiser was being sued for fraud, and the only case law the state of Tennessee Supreme Court could come up with was a case out of New Orleans, Louisiana, that dealt with the valuation of a piece of jewelry. I think the analogy stands. Marty, continue.
Wow, your check's in the mail. I watch Pawn Stars as well. I watch all the shows for a couple of reasons. One is to see how they value something, and it doesn't always. It always is supported by statistics and by analogy, but it still goes back to how did other people. What did they pay for it? Why did they pay for it? Where did they buy? What can I use as comparable? And to me, that's an art. It is an art. Probably the biggest, when I owned the AMC, probably the biggest complaint was somebody who was not geographically competent. Basically, that means you don't know my neighborhoods. And it's, I'm not sure if what you call that is an art. But if you apply only science and you can get 80% correct 80% of the time, from a lending standpoint, that's not even close. And if I'm going to tell my brother to buy something, I hope I'm going to get closer than that. So in that same vein, I am not belittling any of the statistical analyses that's from regression to anything else. I was talking to an appraiser literally 5 minutes before we went on, and asked him. We talked about time adjustments, and he said, "Well, I use, and I think he's used Spark, which gives you four different selections as to use." He says, "Well, one says I'm going to adjust $20,000 a month. The other one says I'm going to adjust," and he told me about it, and I said, "So which one did you use?" And he said, "Well, the one that made sense." He said, "What did you use to make that decision? Did you use gray matter?" And he started pontificating. And I said, no, yes or no. Just yes or no, counselor. Did you use gray matter to select one of the four analytical tools that are in front of you? And he said, yes, I use gray matter. And I rest my case. So the two intertwine, they play. But in the end analysis, and you both as USPAP instructors know that the use of an analytical tool that you don't understand is a USPAP violation, period.
Tim, hop back in here. I didn't mean to step on you so hard, but it was kind of fun.
I'm married. It's okay. I'm used to it. Go ahead. Ask me the question.
No. I'm just asking if you want to respond to Marty's last little bit after my interjection.
Well, Marty just proved my point. Marty asked the appraiser, "Did you use gray matter?" Hello, science. Hello. Thank you, Marty. Checks in the mail, my man.
Well, you should play an attorney on TV anyway. If you're not.
All right, so I want to throw this out there, and I'm kind of going off script a little bit, but Marty brought up geographic competency, and I think this is a really good point to talk about. Tim, if geographic competency is a USPAP issue, how does that fit into the idea of science versus art?
Well, okay. First of all, geographic competency relative to what? I got a call a number of years ago from a guy who was appraising a truck stop, and it wasn't a gas station. I'm talking about, one of these 3-acre things. Okay. And he said, there aren't any truck stops in Mucus, Montana, where I live. Where do I go for comps? I said, well, get a picture of the United States. Okay. Find the Mississippi River. Yeah. Okay. Everything west of it's your neighborhood. Because those people don't buy truck stops. Those people buy investments embodied as truck stops. Okay. So now, is he going to have to go out and become competent in Oregon, Washington, California, Arizona, Nevada, blah, 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 blah? No, he's not. He is going to have to be competent in knowing what cash flow should look like, gasoline sales should look like, facilities should look like, etc. I'm not going to debate that. But geographic competence? Yeah, no, absolutely not. Now, a number of years ago, I was in Charleston, West Virginia, and I was teaching a class. And it was night, and I was in bed reading a book, and the phone rang. It was my family. And they said, Daddy, turn on, I think, cops. Turn on cops. So, okay, I turned on cops. And they're raiding this house because it was a drug house. And I looked at it a little closer. And then I looked at it a little closer. And I could see my house down the street. Okay. And so I didn't even know there was a drug house in my neighborhood. And I lived there. Okay. So the point is geographic. I'm not saying geographical competence is not important. It is. But I think way too often we make much more of it than it really is. And the reason we make much more of it than it really is not because it's unimportant. It's because an appraiser will come in from out of town and make the conscious decision not to become sufficiently competent to appraise that property credibly and report the appraisal non-misleadingly. And that decision just violates all sorts of rules. And it screams incompetence.
Yeah, a really good example, Nashville, Tennessee has an area called Belle Meade. It is inside of Davidson County, which is a metropolitan government. It is its own little municipality inside of that metropolitan government. There is a dividing line between Belle Meade and Green Hills, which is squarely in Davidson County, not its own little municipality. That line is Linwood Boulevard. The west margin of Linwood Boulevard is in Belle Meade. The east margin of Linwood Boulevard is in Green Hills or Davidson County. Nashville appraisers just know that if you're appraising a home in Green Hills, you do not go into Belle Meade to find comparables because the zoning is entirely different. The restrictions are entirely different. And quite honestly, the underlying values based on some of those characteristics are entirely different. There's an appraiser who came into Nashville, moved here from another state, started doing appraisal work, appraised a property over there, and just did not know that. Now, is that art? I don't know that that's art. I think it's just knowledge of the market, but I think it's an interesting question how we as appraisers deal with those things. And Tim, Marty, for Tim's story about the house being busted for drugs down the street, like when Tim told me that story, he said a dentist down the street from me his house was raided and he was arrested for dealing drugs. I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years. I had no idea this guy was a dentist.
Interesting.
Marty, geographic competency, art, science, factual business. Talk about that a little bit.
And I would agree with you that hanging a label on it is it art to know where to select your units of measurement. Tim brings up an interesting point in that if you're looking for a Buc-ee's, okay, and you're looking at a rest stop, the unit of measurement is not quiet enjoyment of the single family residence. So, but you have to know that. You have to have the art or the gray matter inside to know what is my buyer thinking, what's inside the buyer's mind. And it is exactly the same thing. I got in a discussion with a Chicago regulator when I ran the AMC, and he said, well, we don't punish our appraisers for lack of geographic competency, so don't come at us to find somebody guilty of violating geographic competency, because USPAP says they can become geographic competent any time. It says I can go anywhere and I can appraise as long as I know where to select my unit of measurement, what motivates a buyer, and that, if anything, is the art. And my retort to him is said, my bank wants this done in 7 days. I don't have time for the appraiser to become geographically competent. So is it a violation? Yes and no, but I don't have time for that. So when you go into Tennessee and you go into your market area, you expect the appraiser to automatically know that. I don't want to give a lesson to an appraiser. I tried to order a pizza the other day from a hotel room, and he just would not. He said, "No, what's the address?" And finally, I just said, "Have you delivered here before?" And there was this long pause, and I said, "Never mind. I'll find somebody else who has." And that's, I think, the concept. It so much comes down to units of measurement. Commercial, if you're doing an agricultural property, if you've never done an agricultural property, it's going to take you months to become geographically competent. If you're working for me, I want to know you've done it before. I want to know you've come in my neighborhood. I reviewed an appraisal an hour ago where the appraiser in my market was making 10% minus adjustments for a year. I don't have anything to support that. I don't have paired sales. I don't have anything. The gray matter that he used to do that was purely following the statistical analysis. The HPI says that I'm going to use this. That's what I'm going to use, even though there were 2 backup offers and it sold for more than list price. Now, that's anecdotal. I get it. But at one point in time, you have to say, maybe you should look at a different portion of science to see if that holds true. So, if you wanted to call the art of what we do being geographically competent, I guess you could say that.
I'm not saying that geographic competence is art. I'm saying they're look, like everything else. I mean, there's several comments in the Q&A here. Like, we do not provide an opinion. We provide a reconciliation of market indications. This is exactly why it's not art, but science. Personal effects being appraisers is still based on the statistical analysis. What is it? What condition is it in? Based on definition of condition and quality. That's science as well. The issue with Spark, we are not in control of what is happening with our data and may have included outliers that caused the odd time adjustment. That goes to Tim's point about you've got to understand the math behind the programs you're using. This is another one. Scott L. says, the scientific method involves the art of developing a hypothesis, followed by testing the hypothesis by experiment, and then the revision of the hypothesis if indicated by the data. That is clearly what we do as appraisers. There's a note in here that geographic competency is seriously overrated. Statements on this statement on this industry, just like Novocaine implemented the appraisal standards, the standard of operating procedures in USPAP, and the data speaks for itself. Science. There's several other things in here. I'm not going to be able to read through all of them. So there was one comment in the comments thread or the Q&A thread that said, "Hey, I'm a commercial appraiser. Is this primarily geared towards residential?" Yes, it is. Most of the folks that are in the room are going to be residential appraisers, and that is who we're primarily talking to. But the principles apply. The fundamentals apply across the board. I did commercial valuation for 25 years. That's where my background is. I do see that Joseph C. says he wrote a seminar for local chapters in Maryland, DC, Virginia, Delaware called The Art of Comparable Sales Selection and Verifications, but it's directed at commercial appraisers. So if you're interested in diving into this subject for commercial appraisers, Joseph C. put his contact information in the Q&A here. I will make sure that we get that out to the folks in the room. Look, it's an interesting conversation, whether you're residential or commercial appraiser, to think about what part of what we do is based on purely, solely, completely, and nothing else but science, and what part is based purely, solely, completely, and nothing else art. I think we're coming around to an understanding among the three of us that it is almost always a combination of the two. Tim, does that sound fair to you?
Most assuredly so.
Marty, does that sound fair to you?
I can live with that.
Okay, so
yes.
Marty has teased the notion of we're going to talk about AVMs. AVMs are de facto math. It is literally just straight up science. Marty, talk about AVMs and what that means for us as appraiser.
AVMs. Again, and I did my research because back when I was in industry, in industry, we used a lot of them, and I was with on the committees with NAR when they were developing their version of AVMs. And try as they might, and this is probably where I get most of my ammunition. Try as they might, you can't get an AVM that's 90% correct 90% of the time, and that, from a mathematical standpoint, is still only 80%. So if what Tim says is true, is that this is all science, the AVMs wouldn't need what they call a confidence score. A confidence score is something that's applied after you do all the math and you get the AVM and it says $231,000. It will also tell you, by the way, my confidence score is 6, which means I got a 60% chance of this being right. So by the time you think you complete it all, you really don't have anything. And at the end of the day, should you consult an AVM when you're doing the appraisal? I certainly will look at it. I will look to see what Zillow says, or to see what the RVM is through NAR, to see what their analytics say. But their analytics don't select comparables the way we do. So I think one of the things that I do want to make sure that everybody understands, that I believe it is they are all tools, and they are all tools to be used, whether I like them or don't like them. If I look at the 4 different ways that Spark is telling me to make my time adjustments, I'm going to consult one of them. I'm going to use it for backup. So AVMs, unfortunately, many times are given perhaps more credibility than I want to say than they deserve. Because if you go into the eastern side of my state, in the Dearborn area in Michigan, and you got 4,000 sales and they're all 3-bedroom ranches, you can get really close. On the other hand, if you go to Whitefish Point, you may as well throw the AVM away. It's never going to give you what you need. And so I'm not here to condemn AVMs. They are a tool. It's just that by very nature, they lack, again, I'll drive it home, they lack the art of comparable selection.
Tim Andersen.
Okay, at this point, I would just love to take Marty by the throat, shake some sense into him. Unfortunately, I can't, because I agree with him. So the point is, although Marty, I think you may be conflating math with accuracy. Now, let's face it, 2 and 2 is always 4. But so what? Now, let me give you an example. If you take all of your sales and you plot them by their square footage, you are going to, and you run it through a regression program, you are going to get an answer. And that answer is going to be mathematically correct. However, that's why we also take a look at the R and the R squared factors. Because if the R squared factors is 7%, what that means is a change in 1 square foot reflects a change of only 7% of the change in the sales price. Therefore, there's a lot of stuff we're not accounting for. There's a lot of noise. In other words, there's more than one variable. Okay. And single variable regression analysis will not account for it. So the number that the computer gives you is mathematically accurate, and practically useless. Okay. Now, from a standpoint, okay, if you've grown up appraising in Southern California, in Orange County, where there are 5,000 houses in a subdivision, there are 4 floor plans, and 350 of them sell every year, an AVM is gonna do it for you. But as you say, if you're up at Whitefish Bay, no, they won't work. Period. End of sentence. And we can't say we cannot condemn AVMs because there are the times in which they can work any more than we can say regression analysis is universally applicable, because it's not. And this is where the science of understanding the math, etc., precedes the art of choosing which one to use. And yes, it is an art to choose which one to use, but you have to understand the science behind them first.
And before we get off this, I'm continually reminded of Mark Twain's favorite expression about the 3 big lies. You know, there's the white lie, there's the big lie, and there's statistics. You can make them say whatever you want. I questioned the appraiser an hour ago. You're looking at your polynomial grid. How do you know that between January and February more sales of lesser value sold than sold in June, July, and August? When you look at the increase or decrease in sales, and there's a long pause, and he said, "Well, I really don't." Okay. And I said, "Then you need to be careful of how many questions you ask and how you pursue that chart." And I again, it certainly is a tool, because it could be right, but it might also not be right. So I use every tool I can get, whether I think they're out to lunch or not, because it might spur something inside the 5 inches. They go, "You didn't think about this. Perhaps you should," and stop thinking. And by the way, Tim, in our business, 2 and 2 can be 4 1/4. And you can still be correct. I just thought I would say that.
Well, the 2 and 2 can be the square root of 16. Okay, but
I know you go there.
According to the rules of mathematics, because the square root of 16 can be reduced even further, we're not supposed to stop there. But the Hal mentioned this earlier, and again, Marty, I completely agree with you. But we got to understand. So, I'm sorry.
It's 2 times.
Oh, well, and we'll probably agree even more. We all agree on the good restaurants in Las Vegas. Okay. So Hal talking about science being a voyage of discovery. That's why, if you'll recall, Columbus got off the boat and said, "Oh, look, Indians," thinking he was in India, when he wasn't even close.
He wasn't geographically competent.
He wasn't geographically competent. So the point is, yes, we're going to discover stuff as we go through the scientific method of inquiry, but then we have to say, okay, let me pull that out and say, is what I discovered really important? Is it really what I think it is? Which is why you have to come at it from another direction to see if replicating the data, replicating the analyses, gives you essentially the same answers, which is part of the scientific method. And if that replication, if that repetition doesn't closely approximate the first inquiry, then one of them was wrong.
And off the subject, just one second, just 2 seconds. Off the subject for just a second. The challenge appraisers have today, while we discuss all the polynomial graphs and all the analytical tools, I got 4 days to do this. This is supposed to be a summary. Now, I see Tim shaking his head and say, "Yeah, well, that's your problem," and I don't disagree. But at the end of the day, the practical matter is I've been asked to appraise a $1.2 million house on the in Central Florida. I got 3.5 days to do it. and I have accepted it rather than decline it. And so at one point, it's a challenge, and I don't have an answer for that challenge, but I can hear it coming through the screen that appraisers are going, yeah, but you guys are talking all this. I don't have the time to do that.
It literally, as Tim started with his opening statements, he's talking about Da Vinci sitting there for a week, looking at the wall, studying the wall. I'm thinking, God, good Lord, as an appraiser, I've got 20 minutes to decide whether I want to do this thing or not.
Yeah.
And Tim and I have had this conversation a number of times. That's my problem. If I'm going to take the assignment, that's my problem. I want to get some comments from the room real quick. Joseph C. says, art is understanding the dynamic market motivations. Science is data turned into relevant numbers and benchmarks. Judgment is both combined. I think Joseph C. is getting really, really, really close to where we're all going. You can't have one without the other. If you just have science, period, end of sentence, and nothing else, if that works, then we're in real trouble. And I think Tim and Marty have both alluded to the fact that there are situations where that actually can work today. If you've got a subdivision in Franklin, Tennessee that has the Lincoln, the Democrat, and the Bros models, there are 3 variations on a theme in a subdivision of 500 homes. There's 200 of each one, plus or minus. You're literally looking at a thing that an AVM can probably get its head around. And I'm just going to throw this out there. And again, this is totally off script, but as appraisers, Tim, Marty, I want to get your opinion on this. I used to like it when I would get a cookie cutter in the door. When we were crazy busy during COVID, like I got a cookie cutter, I can get this done really quickly. But my actual heart is, I like the one-offs, the weirdos, the unusual properties where I get to dive in and do things. And during COVID, we didn't have time to dive into things very much. As appraisers, should we be thinking about the one-offs, the unusuals, the inner city lots? My home is in an inner city lot in Nashville, Tennessee. It's got a historic overlay. There is a very defined area that is a historic overlay. People that are looking for those properties stay inside that area. But an AVM has a really hard time with that because these homes, our house was built in 1907. From the outside, it looks really similar to most of the houses on my street, but they are completely different beasts when you start digging into them. So should we, as appraisers, consider focusing on one-offs, focusing on the hard ones, focusing on the rural properties, the Whitefish Point, those kind of properties?
I'll jump in front of Tim for a change. Thank you, Tim, for allowing me to do this. I think we won't make that decision. I think literally the AVMs, as you know, I still do a couple appraisals a week. I got a 3-bedroom bath and a half cookie cutter, and I looked at that and I went, these aren't going to come for very much longer. I think I'll do this one. I talk to more and more appraisers that are in my classes, and they're saying, this work's getting harder. And when it is, because those 3-bedroom cookie cutter ranches are not going to come that more often, that much anymore. And so my answer to your question is, I don't think that's going to be our decision. I think a few years from now, everybody complains that they're not getting work because they're getting waivers value acceptance, and that is exactly that. It's just a direct cause of that. They're not going to ask you about the property in Dearborn. I already know what that's worth. It's an 80% loan to value ratio. The credit score is 805. I'm lending on risk. And we confuse, and coming back from NAR meetings, it's more and more clear that appraisers are confusing Fannie Mae's movement toward risk is somehow directly opposite what we're doing and what we're appraising. And when that's they're lending on risk. You're appraising for value, and you're going to end up with the harder ones.
Yeah, to that point, you know, from day one, real estate appraisal was part of a due diligence process to get your head around risk. It is a part of the risk analysis. When you hear people who are buying mortgages in the secondary market, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, then selling on it, they're looking at credit risk and collateral risk. We are part of the collateral risk process. Tim, your thoughts on should we be looking at one-offs, unusuals, and interesting?
Yeah, because that's where the market's going to be. It's simply because for the easy ones, the cookie cutter ones, the guy that has $1 million house paid for and he wants to borrow $100,000 to buy a new truck, we're not going to do those. AVMs are going to do those. Hell, somebody owns $1 million house and they want to borrow $100,000 to buy a new truck. The bank shouldn't let him get out of the lobby without a check. All right. Well, you don't need an appraisal for that. Now, if the guy says, no, damn it, I want an appraisal and I'll be happy to pay for it. Okay. But the point is the banks are trying to say, you know, we have certain market demands we have to meet. And one of those is speed. And therefore, we've got to change the way we do things. Now, Marty and I wrote a paper called The Ethics of Change. And we discovered 2 areas of interest. Number one, it might be perfectly wonderful to change. And number 2, it might be an utter tragedy to change. Therefore, the issue is not change. The issue is the motivation behind it. So if appraisers are going to say, I may be out of a job in 2 years when AVMs and appraisal waivers and value acceptance and Taco Tuesdays, etc., go into effect, okay, then do something about it. And that is become good at the one-offs. So basically, they're either that or get out of the business because there's nothing else to do.
Marty, final thoughts on that?
No, I again, that's the third time, certainly the third time we've agreed today, and I'm fully on board with that. I'm lucky in that I live in little Southwest Michigan. There aren't a lot of big subdivisions. Almost everything is a problem. The white points are few and far between. You know, but we're in the land of, I don't know how many, we used to say 10,000 lakes, but that's Minnesota. And lake properties are just difficult to do for any AVM. But it's when we talk about Tim and I talk about the ethics of change. The other thing we found out is not a lot of people want to read that article, by the way, you know. The ethics, at one point, refusing to change, and in some of my classes I engage with the students, you're refusing to change ultimately borders on an ethical issue. At one point, not wanting, if you're a doctor, not knowing or wanting to do a heart stent as opposed to open heart surgery eventually borders on an ethical issue. And you know, we have to adapt. We have to look at the things I find a lot of appraisers are angry because the AVMs in some cases are working so well. I can't change that. We have technology now, even in the last few years, that we never had before. And it's just, it is there. And the Fannie Mae used to rely on the appraisers to come up, use their gray matter, and come up with a value. And now if they have a 50% loan to value ratio and everything else, they're going to, it's just risk. I don't need that.
Yeah.
So I agree.
I want to get to the comments real quick. Spencer P says, through the appraisal, and I think this is directed straight at me. But through the appraiser's experience and repetition, they have already made weeks-long analysis for the painting. So based on previous experience in that area, one can understand quickly if they can do the assignment or not. Fair point. Absolutely fair point. I talk about this in class sometimes. You know, residential appraisers get tagged sometimes for not performing a full highest and best use. I would argue that highest best use being a standard one issue. Reporting of highest best use is a separate issue. Reporting highest best use is summarize what you did for your highest best use analysis. I've seen appraisers forget to summarize, yet they've done the highest best use. And here's my argument on that point. If you're a residential appraiser in Franklin, Tennessee, appraising homes in the subdivisions down there, you have done the highest best use 1,000 times. It takes you that long to do the highest best use analysis. So I take your point, Spencer. Very well said. Yeah, and look, I mean, you know, he also says, you know, this process is how we test the methods and hopefully learn. Again, this falls into the scientific process. You come up with an idea, you test it. If it doesn't work out, you pivot, you test another thing. You know, that's it. There's an interesting comment here from Mark K. Unfortunately, the secondary market is not willing to pay for the complex and risky properties that do not fit into an AVM model. Marty, any thoughts on that? The secondary market wants standard; they don't want the one-offs.
You know, I'm on a committee that oversees professional conduct, so I spend some time looking at Facebook, and more than not, my comment, and it's kind of a fatalistic comment. It's after I listen to the diatribe of what they're asking, my comment is you need a new client. At one point, I was a regulator, as you know, for several years for Michigan. The first two cases that I listened to, it was clear. My comment to the appraiser: why didn't you just decline? Don't do it. It is probably the worst mistake that I see over and over again is appraisers doing exterior onlys or desktop appraisals because they were told to, when they shouldn't. You don't have enough information. So one of my favorite comments is sometimes the best appraisal you do is the one you don't. And it's I don't disagree. At one point, you have to do what you have to do. Yeah, it's a fatal. You know, it's simplistic comment. And if you don't want to do it, you don't do it.
Yeah. Tim, thoughts on that real quick?
For Marty, it's you know, somebody calls up and says, I want you to go appraise this house, and while you're doing it, you got to stand on your head and wiggle your left ear. Well, okay, if you take the assignment under those conditions, then you're going to have to. But when somebody says that we want you to travel 200 miles each way and appraise a 25,000 square foot house on a 500-acre ranch that's off the grid, and you go, oh, okay, I'll do that for insert small number here, then that's your damn problem. And the fact that the secondary market, quote unquote, doesn't want to pay, okay, well, I want a new Bentley, but I'm not willing to pay for it. Well, therefore, I don't go into the Bentley dealerships. Okay.
Oh, I go in there occasionally, just
but you walk out without a car title. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, gentlemen, we're brushing up against the end of our time together. Tim, I'm going to let you go first with closing statements, and then we'll go to Marty with closing statements.
Okay. First of all, I appreciate the fact that Marty is such an able and facile opponent, because this is not the first time we've talked about this stuff, obviously.
Facile? Is that a bad thing? Okay, sorry.
F-A-C-I-L-E.
Okay, I will look it up while you're talking. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Marty and I have covered these things many times. We already knew where each of us stood. And the purpose of the debate is not so much to change each other's minds, because quite frankly, we haven't. That would imply I had a mind to change. But the purpose of the five, good man. The purpose of this is to look at stuff from another direction. How does somebody else think about this, and why? So that's why we do this. And if what we've done here today makes somebody, and you know, depending on where you are, it's almost lunchtime, go to lunch and go, maybe I need to think about what Marty and Hal and Tim said today about things. And that's why we do this. Damn sure ain't the money. So we do this out of a sense of responsibility, quite frankly, bordering on love, because we want to share what we know and we want to share what we're capable of. And even though Marty's wrong on the art thing, I still love him to death because he is such a wonderful and facile opponent.
Facile, thank you.
I don't think that word means what you think it means. Marty, go ahead.
Okay, I'm still looking up facile. Sorry, but this one of the taglines for this was, "Is this the hill you want to die on?" That we talked about, and I go back a couple of years ago. I have an 11-year-old grandson, and I was railing about school, about whatever, and he just turned. I was sitting in the back seat, and he turned on and says, "Poppy, you just got to adapt." And I never forgot that. And the next week, I was sitting in church, and my priest came up and said, it isn't always. His comment was, "Progress is not always forward." And I thought about that for a long time, and I still think about it, and I still say it in class. We had a meeting at NAR when we talked about the amount of, we were discussing the property data inspection concept. And progress is a funny thing. But progress doesn't happen at all unless you adapt and unless you get involved in expanding your mind. And Tim is right. I'm not sure it's whether I want to expound on what I know as much as what I've been through. I started in the appraisal business. I won't tell you when, but long enough to see 2 solid recessions, and enough to see things change and see what turned out to be progress and what turned out not to be progress. And history and financial markets decide what's progress and what isn't. But those of us who are still around adapted. And when somebody said, "Can you do this?" I said, "No." "But can you do this?" And I said, "Yeah, I can do that. I can apply the principles." And Tim and I have talked many times about how many poor business decisions are made under the guise of USPAP, under the guise, "Oh no, I can't do that because." And well, you really can, if you really understood. So I've been through this 4 decades, and I've seen almost every 5 years being told, you're going to be replaced. And some of us who won't adapt probably will be replaced. Those of us who will still be here. And I'll wrap up to say, and it's because of the gray matter. It's because the best an AVM can do is get 80% accurate. And when they're writing 90%, 95% loan to value ratios, and they're lending on risk. An AVM still has proven itself as not being accurate enough times to replace the appraisal profession.
Tim, Marty, thank you both so much for sharing your time with us today and trying to tackle the topic. And I think everybody in the room is fairly clear on the notion that is it art? Is it science? They're not mutually exclusive. We deal in scientific issues. We deal in artistic issues. How we interpret those things may be a little bit different, but they're both there. At the end of the day, whether you call it art or science, great appraisal starts the same way, with mastery of the fundamentals. If we master the fundamentals and we have all of the fundamentals squarely in our toolkit, think about, all right, so I mentioned jazz in the opening bit. Think about Miles Davis. Miles Davis could play it straight as well as anybody because he mastered the fundamentals of music theory and his instrument and those kind of things. If we have a mastery of our fundamentals and we have a mastery of how to apply those fundamentals, when it's necessary, we can pivot and apply those same principles in an artistic way. Am I suggesting that we're going to be jazz musicians? Probably not, although Danny Regalado might be because he plays saxophone. Look, knowing the rules so well, you can break them with purpose. Knowing the rules so well, you can apply them to things you didn't consider applying them to before. Proper science is not a recipe. It's curiosity, discipline, and the guts to follow the data where it leads, even when it's inconvenient. Thank you all for being with us today. Joining us here on the green. Keep asking why. And if you have questions or if you've got a topic you'd like for us to debate, please send it in to us. Jim Morrison, if you'll hop in here and tell them how to get in touch with us. Meanwhile, you will notice up on your screen there is a discount code for Valuation Expo in Las Vegas, August 11 through 13. If you use the discount code WIGS, you'll get 20% off of general session.
Thank you all so much for joining us, guys. Great job. That was a lot of fun. You can reach out to us at comments@appraisalbuzz.com. And, you know, we have classes from both of you coming up with Appraiser eLearning. We'd love to see everybody join us for.
Gentlemen, thanks. If we've got nothing else, Jim, you can shut her down. Everybody have a great rest of the day and a great weekend coming up.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.